within the first 7 years of its life, approximately the time it takes to weigh a pound. A lobster can shed its shell up to 25 times. However, as the lobster grows bigger, a number of molting events decreases. See, juveniles molt several times a year. As adults, they molt only once a year. Now, because lobsters molt, they can regenerate lost limbs. Did you know that? Show of hands. Molting, or exodysis, comes from the Greek language meaning putting off, the art of escaping their old shell. In order to grow, you see, the lobster must remove itself from its shell. See, if a lobster stays as it is, it will die. And this is a very dangerous time for lobsters because they have no armor until the new one grows in. Now, I learned this from a guy who wrote a great book called Becoming Better Grown-Ups. His name is Brad Montague. Anyway, imagine the pressure a lobster feels as it gets bigger on the inside. And as their shells, they can't contain it. The process of crawling out leaves them exhausted and exposed. It's harrowing and stressful. It's an extremely dangerous time. Lobsters are at a risk of being eaten, and so for protection, they hide in a dark place where they can rest and heal. And then one day, everything is different, and they can rejoin ocean life bigger and stronger than before, at least until it grows out of its shell again and again and again. You see, the lobster's in a constant state of regrowth. Renewal is perpetual. They spend most of their time preparing for renewal or recovering from it. But wait, there's more. Did you know that lobsters, do you know that what they do with their old shells? They eat them for nourishment. Maybe instead of being nostalgic about our last pain or our failures, in lieu of carrying them around, maybe they could become fuel for our journey to greatness. Who knew lobsters could teach us humans a lesson? You see, growing into the fullness of who we are meant to be, it requires risk. It takes everything we've got, and it's exhausting. But refusing to grow is an offense to the natural order of things. You see, in other words, adversity can be inflated or it can be deflated. Now, I'll repeat that. Adversity can be inflated or deflated. Listen up, we're all rookies and amateurs and apprentices and beginners in some area of life. But if you have a pulse, you have a chance to grow. Somebody wiser than me said it this way: you must learn a new way to think before you can master a new way to be. I'm a life coach for kids. I'm not the teacher. I'm not the parent, and I'm not the therapist. I'm the education architect who designs structures and systems that facilitate transformation. In other words, if you know a child who's struggling with self-management or self-esteem, send their parents or their caregivers my way at empoweredkids.info. Little commercial there. Well, listen, it's because today's kids were already experiencing mental health problems before the pandemic, as evidenced by the many publicized outrageous acts of violence. Then comes COVID-19, lockdowns, mandates, and a slew of other concerns, and everybody's anxiety levels were elevated. Is there any good that can come out of this? Well, I remain relentlessly optimistic, and here's why. According to Barna's research, 82% of Gen Z members believe that they've been traumatized. And while it sounds extreme, many of them feel postponed, pushed aside, penalized. In 2020, they had no proms, no signed yearbooks, strange graduation ceremonies. They felt grief and loss and isolation and so much angst. Well, these kids deserve special leadership. Younger children in the alpha generation, they're observing and forming memories of older populations who are divided and diseased and depressed. Well, I'd like to take a walk down memory lane. What can we learn from history? How have past tragedies, crises, or pandemics affected us? Now, how did past generations of adults and teachers and parents lead children through these crises? Well, researchers have revised the traditional view of psychological trauma, which emerged after World War I when soldiers were diagnosed with the condition known as shell shock. It was ultimately known by a broader term, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. But stress doesn't have to cause a disorder. It can be leveraged for good. You see, beginning in the 1990s, psychologists noticed that at least half of the population had endured a traumatic event, loss of a limb or whatever, showed no signs or symptoms of past traumatic stress. In fact, 4 out of 5 trauma victims did not suffer from PTS afterward. In fact, typically they emerge stronger, and instead of being permanently scarred by the tragedy, they experience post-traumatic growth, or PTG. Studies reveal that more than 60%, and sometimes even as high as 80%, the trauma victims undergo post-traumatic growth, including ones who have showed initially symptoms of PTSD. Psychologists now use this chart to track PTG. These people are enjoying increased appreciation of life, deeper relationships with others, new perspectives and priorities, and greater personal strength. So, how do you or I ensure that good comes from bad? Well, I believe we can come out of this pandemic with a hopeful rather than despairing narrative. Did you know that Isaac Newton was a student during the Great Plague of London? It was the end of a terrifying pandemic, and he was sent home from Cambridge University in the school's own version of social distancing. Instead of wasting those months, he decided to take advantage of the moment. And it was in quarantine that Newton created the course we now know as calculus. He also came up with his theories on optics, which we still use today. And finally, when an apple fell from a tree, he discovered the laws of motion and the laws of gravity, or the law of gravity. And all this happened when he was in quarantine during that dreadful era of history. And now I conclude with 2 questions. What might kids achieve today if we guide them well? What might you achieve if you molted and then ate your shells?